Hey guys, my name is Matt Odell. I've had done a lot of things in the Bitcoin space. I'm managing partner of 1031, a venture fund that supports Bitcoin companies, including Jack's company. Co-founder of OpenSats, which is a 501c3 organization that's 100% pass-through, runs on a Bitcoin standard, and supports open source contributors. And I've had the honor and privilege of working with the Human Rights Foundation on their Bitcoin education now for a little over 5 years. And I will say that every time I work with the Human Rights Foundation, every time I work with all the amazing activists around the world, it's inspiring. It's motivating. It reminds me. It reminds so many people why this work is so important and how much work is left to be done. I'm grateful. I'm humbled, and we have a really tough act to follow here, Jack.
An impossible one. This graphic is overwhelming me.
I know it's a little bit overwhelming.
No kidding.
I mean, I think an interesting place to start here is your announcement with Callie up here about eCash and the new foundation that he's starting to help distribute funding throughout the protocol among all the developers. You know, you're up here briefly, but I would love to just jump in a little bit further in this idea of, you know, profitable Bitcoin businesses contributing to open source, whether that's through direct development or whether that's supporting developers, and how you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, in hindsight, it makes all the sense in the world, right? Like, we have a vested interest in Bitcoin being successful. That's part of the game theory that makes the whole project work. And so no matter your role, we're all on the same team. If Bitcoin's better, we're all better off for it. In hindsight, that makes sense. At the time, though, as the CEO and founder of a regulated company, I unfortunately took the really lazy approach of, well, you know, I hope you guys figure out the privacy stuff. Looks challenging, but I can't do it. I go straight to prison. I might as well just walk myself to Manhattan District. So that was unfortunately the approach until I did some work with Alex and the Human Rights Foundation and realized that I feel almost a moral obligation as a business because, listen, I sell Bitcoin, and it's a great business. Like, running a BTC USD product is a phenomenal business, and it's far more, though, self-interested, admittedly, in running a corporation than something like what Callie's doing. And so through my work with HRF and coming here, there is a duty that I have to making sure Bitcoin is successful, although not maybe in my shareholders, in my corporation's immediate interest, if that makes sense. You know, in traditional business, you would never take corporate cash flow and give it to some developer in their parents' basement to try and build, you know, David Chalmers. I actually don't know where Callie works. It's probably not his parents' basement, but you wouldn't take like cash flow and go to the board meeting and say, hey guys, we're going to take, you know, all this cash flow, and instead of giving it to shareholders or dividends or investing in future growth, we're going to give it to this anonymous dude who's going to take David Chalmers' vision and change the world with it. But because of Bitcoin, it all works out, and we're a way better company for it. And so I would encourage other businesses to go through the mental exercise and challenge themselves in that way, because it is, in my opinion, lazy. Like, if I'm critical of myself, it was very not cool of me for my approach. And at Strike, we hold ourselves to a pretty serious accountability. We have a 501c3 now internally at the company. We've never made it very public, but we've set up a lot of infrastructure so that we could take cash and give to Bitcoin in ways that as a business we can't. But that's still a responsibility we share. And I hope we inspire other businesses like Jack, the other Jack, inspired me in this way. And I hope a lot of the other companies in the space, as number goes up, can find themselves, whether it's working with Alex and HRF or specific efforts. We could talk about privacy, but yeah.
The other Jack. Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said here, right? Because just the power of open source software. That open source software is not owned by a single individual. It's not owned by a company. It's in the commons, right? It's in the commons. It's available to everyone that they can build on, they can monetize, they can use, they can ship, they can modify it to their heart's content. And as a result, it's viral in nature. It outlives all of us. And it's really easy to think of it's really easy to fall in the hole of thinking of Bitcoin as a tech project. I mean, ultimately, it is this software tool. It's this software package that people can use. But it's also a movement, and it's a movement of individuals around the world that are pushing forward every day, and they're using this tool, and they're using other open source tools available to them. And this greater open source movement, and you mix that in with this freedom movement of people and empowering those people, and it just starts to compound in ways you can't even comprehend. You know, it's incredibly easy to come here and be frustrated, and there's so many authoritarian governments, and people are getting beat up and thrown in jail and killed, that hope is lost. But real progress is being made every day, and it just compounds over and over and over again on the work of others, and it's just incredibly powerful.
You know what's interesting though is I haven't found a way to articulate this yet, but the Bitcoin fixes the physical monetary bearer instrument of Bitcoin fixes this problem. The internet, Google doesn't have as much of a vested interest in the success of the open web. But as a Bitcoin company, I do in Bitcoin. And I think it is fundamentally because Bitcoin allows the free market to value the project in the form of a monetary instrument. Where if the individual had a way of selling or buying the open free internet, I think it'd be a lot different of incentive structure for some of these like really big internet corporations to invest more in the success of the overall web as opposed to their own self-interest. And so I think that has to be said out loud as well. This is very unique. Open source software, you're 100% correct. But then even on top of open source software, Bitcoin open source software is very special.
We talked so much that you answered the question that I hadn't got to ask yet,
there you go.
Which was, I mean, I kind of think of Bitcoin as like this shared equity, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just shared between founders of profitable businesses, but it's also shared among open source contributors. It's shared among freedom fighters, and it's pretty crazy how that works out.
And in theory, like if you believe in free markets, you believe that they are the judge, right? They hold us all accountable. If we need another barbershop in town, then someone can create it, and the free market's either going to let it stay in business or it won't, right? And so I think the free market holds the industry accountable, in my opinion. And I think we've seen businesses like Coinbase lose a lot of, arguably Strike has an opportunity to be a company because Coinbase screwed up a lot in not supporting Bitcoin in the ways like I'd love. Shout out Brian Armstrong. You should fund Cashew in Cali, right? So there's a way. Yeah, there's a way for us to. Bitcoin allows the free market to hold corporations accountable because it is so grassroots. So,
I love it. Well, thank you for supporting open source. One of the trends that we've seen over the last 2 days, or this is the day 3, but over the course of this week, is this trend about the power of using these social media networks, using Twitter. There's a lot. There was so many talks where it was like, everything I do is on Twitter. The only reason I'm standing on this stage is because I'm on Twitter. Mm-hmm. I actually think like our friendship started because of Twitter as well. Just to add that in there. But I want to bring up Noster. You mentioned the other Jack. He brought it up on stage. Mm-hmm. Where does Noster fit into all of this? We're talking about Bitcoin. We're talking about Bitcoin as a shared equity. Like, why would people support Noster if there isn't like a token attached to it, or like Bitcoin's its token, I guess?
Yeah, with my Noster shitcoin,
yeah.
That'll get Andreessen out of his pants for sure. Why do people support it?
Where does Noster fit into all of this? Like, why is Noster important? Why should people pay attention to it?
Well, there's clearly value in free speech.
Yeah.
Obviously. And as that is challenged, and maybe Jack said yesterday to quote him, maybe it's more free will. But as that's challenged, then the market is going to value and place a premium on technologies that protect and afford it. And so I think, Noster is interesting because it isn't necessarily a technological innovation. As I used to write code, believe it or not, and it isn't a lot. There was no Byzantine generals problem that was solved necessarily. It is more of a movement. I think when Jack talked about the early days of why he found it so exciting was the energy. It was the energy of Bitcoin combined with open internet enthusiasts. And so I think Noster is where the market is gradually placing a premium on free will and free speech. That is my basic answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to this, this idea that all this open source work kind of compounds on top of each other, right? And you have like this communication protocol on Noster, you have this freedom money in terms of Bitcoin. You have this, in both cases, they rely on cryptographic signatures and public key, private key pairs. So they're verifiable. Right?
I'll ask you a question, because I talk about this all the time. I don't have a good answers. What do you think we do about adoption? There's so many keynotes we went to and saw yesterday that cited Twitter and X as taking their account down, censoring local government, being able to take away information from the populace strategically. And I'm sitting next to Bitcoiners like, these guys want to download Primal or it feels like we have a solution that either, is it a marketing problem? Is the desire for the tech? What do you think? The difference between today's world and a better world because of this technology, what's the delta in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to Bitcoin in that, right? It's like open source protocols don't have, a centralized marketing budget. They don't have a centralized dev team. Like things take time to build out. I mean, Noster's way younger than Bitcoin too. Noster's about 3 years old at this point. It's barely beginning and it's moving fast. But even in Bitcoin terms, I mean, we had a whole conversation about the spread of CBDCs, like what Bitcoin adoption. You especially when you come to these things, you're like, how are more people not using Bitcoin up until this point? And I think a lot of it is need. As people realize the need, they will search out the tools that empower them and solve that need. That's one of the reasons why working with HRF is so fulfilling, because I mean, you don't have to explain the need to people that are living in adversarial environments. Like they wholly understand that need. They're just like, how do I solve that need? What are the tools available to me? And I think Noster it's going to be interesting because it's this whole idea of a web of trust. Like I think the web of trust aspect is what people don't realize is so powerful about the whole thing, especially when you combine it with Bitcoin. And cryptographers and cypherpunks have been trying to make web of trust a thing for decades now. But I think what we needed the ability to shitpost our way to web of trust. And I think that's where we are at Noster right now. And so it's going to start with shitposts. It's people building out their social graphs, which private keys they trust, who they follow, who follows them. And then all of a sudden you're going to start to see really powerful content, speech that cannot be stopped, combined with money that cannot be stopped, and the ball will just start rolling and it'll just compound and then the rest will be history.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the ingenious insights that Satoshi had about Bitcoin was bootstrapping a network. It's very difficult. I mean, we're all speculating and it's based on our own interpretation, but the way I look at halvings, I mean, I grew up in Chicago from agriculture commodity markets, and I think of halvings as an inventory reduction. So it's not priced in or not priced in. You're just reducing the inventory of the finished produced crop by half. In the drought in the late 80s that my dad and grandfather went through, inventory was reduced by like 15%. We're talking corn and wheat, and everyone freaked out. Markets shut down. So here's this commodity. its inventory reduction by 50%. It's like, my goodness, Satoshi, you're going to make all of us puke all over ourselves. The chart's going to go, and that's exactly what it did. But it's the idea that, and I personally think that was intentional, and it was to bootstrap a network. Is how do you go from zero to, the reason you leave Twitter, you don't leave Twitter unless you're you, is because there's a network there. There's a network of people, and so how do you rebuild that network effect? Bitcoin's so unique in that it's bootstrapped on a monetary asset. So I would leave Bitcoin if the network was only 2 people, because then I'm getting in at 1 penny. I wish I could, right? So it solved that very hard problem that I think Noster is going to have a tough time with. And I'm hopeful that I wonder if Bitcoin can help bootstrap other freedom networks. Does that make sense? I wonder, because it is a movement. It really has become a larger than life idea. Like, if for whatever reason Bitcoin were to technically have an issue, I don't think it can fail. It's like an idea whose time has come. And it's so unique that a software project can solve the network problem and build on network effects with no marketing, with no anything, and that you have an incentive to join the network even if the network's 2 people, because it's a money. And I'm hopeful, but cautiously optimistic that other freedom tech can borrow from the network effect. That's how I view Noster's initial success, is a bunch of Bitcoiners that are just not going to let this idea die. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so when I first got into Bitcoin like 11 years ago, one of the things that everyone always said was, Bitcoin, we're all going to get wealthy, and then the Bitcoiners are going to spread their ideals around the world, and it's going to fix everything. And, I think people tend to lack nuance and go to extremes about pretty much everything they talk about. But there's something there. And so Noster to me is this first child project of Bitcoin. It was birthed by Bitcoiners. A Bitcoiner founded it. He launched it as an open source protocol. It's being seeded by Bitcoiners. Bitcoiners are leaving Twitter and going Noster only to jumpstart the network effect. They're building it out. And that's also kind of how I see OpenSats, and that's how I see HRF Dev Fund, and that's how I see your company's support of open source software. I mean, OpenSats specifically, and by the way, I think we have like 30,000 people watching this live stream right now. So if you are an open source contributor around the world, go to opensats.org/apply. Consider it. We would love to support you. But like, OpenSats couldn't run without Bitcoin, period. Like, not only is the board all Bitcoiners, but our treasury is held in Bitcoin. All the payments are made out in Bitcoin. The grant payments are made out in Bitcoin. I mean, we're sending nearly 130 grant payments a month as monthly payments, almost like a payroll. It's like we're running like a Bitcoin standard payroll. Imagine if, and I don't know how many countries it is. I don't have the stats in front of me, but let's just say it's 40 countries. Imagine if we were sending out 130 payments as wires to 40 countries. I don't even know if that's possible to do that.
I wouldn't be bullish on it, no.
I mean, I would be pulling my hair out, I'll tell you that much, if it was even possible. So I think there is something there about kind of like Bitcoin, the open source movement has always been strong, but just really like pouring gasoline on the fire and kind of just like supercharging it and making it move quicker. Because especially when you come to these events, right? It's like time is of the essence. I feel like we need all this stuff yesterday.
I agree. I mean, Bitcoin's the biggest wealth transfer in at least modern human history. For people that are like, price doesn't matter, I call bullshit. Price matters a lot. I mean, price to me is the most active index we have on how much of the world is using the money. And I think it's really important that there is a transfer of wealth. I mean, it's demonetizing. I mean, there are people with a tremendous amount of wealth that's been passed down Manhattan real estate for 4 or 5 generations. That guy's he's not funding Kali. He's just not. And so I think it's important that we're demonetizing that wealth and putting it into active hands of people that are in this conference and in this room. So I couldn't agree more with you. I think that's right. I mean, I said earlier, I think Bitcoin is pure humanity. I really do. I think the human story is engineering a better world. The human story is commercializing energy from the sun. And Bitcoin is energy money. It's literally that. And it's literally an engineering project. It's our first engineered man-made money. And so being bullish on Bitcoin is being bullish on humanity and placing a premium on the future. And so I think if we're able to capitalize on this wealth transfer, in theory, it would be a much better world with wealth being with this room versus, I don't know, Jerome Powell or whatever. I don't know. So let me pivot this because I want to just light a little fire. Do you mind?
Yeah, go for the pivot.
Okay.
Thanks for having me as your guest.
I took over. So you recently got in a fight on the internet with Michael Saylor, and which is in a good place, right? Can I say real quick? I asked you a question. Won't let you answer. For the Bitcoiners out there, either in this room or on the internet, that adults are going to fight about important stuff, and it doesn't mean that they don't like each other and can't get along. If this is the most important thing that we're all working on, like, grow up. You're going to disagree. So let me say that. I'm poking fun at you, but hopefully people understand that context. I just went through my third halving. Adults fight all the time on this stuff because it's that important. So people should grow up. It's okay. I mean, I know you and Saylor respect each other, and if you want to comment on that. But the actual question was more, as I listen to these talks, there's a lot of things Bitcoin doesn't solve yet. And there's this idea of ossification and going slow versus using engineering and software to solve problems. Given the context of you in the last month, I would be curious your on-the-record opinion at this conference. What are you looking at me like that for? What do you think? Where do you stand?
You gotta love on-the-record opinions. Yeah, I mean, you can disagree with people you respect. Like, I think that's lost on a lot of people, especially in the era of, like, social media drama. And I will say, to me, it was always less a fight. Like, I don't think we ever really fought. I think it was just me making public that he was telling firms not to support open source contributors, while I was doing the opposite and trying to fight an uphill battle of convincing the very few companies that are graciously supporting open source. And I didn't, in general, I think that these conversations should be out in the open. I think that's why Noster is so important. I think that's why events like this are so important. Because, there's a time and place for closed door meetings and backroom discussions, but there needs to be light on something as important as this. I will say that, first off, it depends on the project, right? So, like, when you look at OpenSats, we have 130 grants, about 130 grants, slightly less than that. 12 of them are working on Bitcoin Core or directly or right next to Bitcoin Core. The rest are working on all these other projects that are surrounding Bitcoin. That Bitcoin is made more robust as a system that people rely on to use Bitcoin, whether there's wallets or Lightning development, Noster, Tor, Graphene OS, right? And with those things, you're not building the basis of a distributed global censorship-resistant financial network. So you can move faster on those things. Like, I think one of the breaths of fresh air that for a lot of Bitcoin developers is you're working on, like, this. On Bitcoin, you're working on this, especially on the protocol level, this generational project that intentionally moves slowly and is very conservative in development because you don't want to break it. And then you get to something like Noster, and you just ship in development. Like, you're just, like, actively just modifying things, breaking things, and you have nothing to worry about because at the end of the day, like, especially if you're an app developer in Noster, at the end of the day, they can just take their private key and go to someone else's app if your app breaks that morning. And, like, maybe they can't shitpost that day. It's like it's not the end of the world. So I think there's nuance here. I will say that there's a tendency of people, especially in the era of social media, the Instagram era, the TikTok era, of seeing other people do things and then deciding to themselves that they don't have to do something. That, I always go back to, like, George Bush on the aircraft carrier, like, mission accomplished. Like, they see, maybe you support Cali, or they see OpenSat send grants out, or they see one of these activists successfully navigate a protest movement, and they're like, okay, like we solved the problem, like it's solved. And on open source specifically, and Bitcoin development specifically, it is so far away from being solved or oversaturated. Like these open source contributors have very little support. They have more support than they've ever had before. But it's not just money. It's also burnout. Like the burnout is real. And the navigating, especially on the protocol level, like navigating the hard conversations of potential protocol changes or how you would activate it, it gets rightfully, I think, fierce out there, right? Like people get into very heated arguments. And there's a lot of personal attacks that happen. So I think it's important for people to realize that. It's important that we have more support. I think every profitable business in the world should be supporting open source contributors. I definitely think every profitable Bitcoin business should be supporting open source contributors. And I think it's going to be a long marathon. It's not a sprint, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think the way I like to think about it is that, Bitcoin has everything to lose with every decision. You know the phrase like, well, what do you have to lose? It's very rare that when you're making a decision on a technology that you have everything to lose all the time. It's like, Sailor draws the analogy to an airplane. It's like, why don't we try this new feature on the wing of the airplane? It was like, well, because you might kill everyone. And so when you have a technology where you have everything to lose, what do? You probably take your time, right? And you probably make sure you got it right, because there's never going to be the R&R, the risk reward is never going to be in your favor, right? Which is interesting. It's just a reality of the project. But every time I'm able to be in the room with activists and folks from not America, generally speaking, but Africa is a continent that I've been focusing on a lot. It's clear that Bitcoin doesn't fix everything. So it's interesting. There's going to be debates and disagreements, but I'm hopeful we'll find our way. Which I was going to ask you one more on the back half of this is, what do you think for a lot of what we've heard today on usability? I'm going to botch the quote, but it was about Abu Bakr. It was like, don't start another wallet or another fund, right? It was like utility. It was we need to make this thing a lot more useful. There's problems it can solve. Given the context of building on a protocol where you constantly have everything to lose, what do you think adoption-wise in that realm of Bitcoin, which I obviously have an opinion, but I'm curious of yours first.
I don't really follow what you...
Do we, like, for utility on top of Bitcoin, do we need new features, new technology? Why haven't we solved the problems we've heard today? And given if it is a bunch of new features and new technology and capabilities, are we going to be able to achieve that soon, later-ish? Do you have an opinion on that?
I mean, I think we shouldn't rush into any kind of major changes with Bitcoin, period. I think Bitcoin needs to be simple. It needs to be robust. Like I said, the base of a global financial network, distributed, censorship-resistant financial network. Especially when we're in the realm of in that kind of situation is in your threat model at the protocol level is nation-state threat modeling, right? It's does a major nation-state try to break this thing? And what you need there is you need basically two core things. You need, first of all, people to be able to interact with the network without trust, be able to actually validate and verify what's going on there, and be able to actually hold self-custody and hold Bitcoin themselves. And I don't think that's it's an unsolved problem. And like one of the things that is really powerful about something like Cashew is it just doesn't require a protocol change, and it makes custodial Bitcoin better, right? It adds privacy. It makes it easier for people to use custodial Bitcoin, to launch other competing custodians and have a free market and whatnot. But to me, that is not the ultimately, it would be great if the user experience for self-custody could be more competitive with the user experience of custodial, and we don't know how to do that yet, right?
Yeah, good answer. I agree.
Awesome. Jack, thank you for having me on your show.
Yep, you're welcome.
Guys, thank you for joining us.
I'm here all week.
And huge thanks to the Human Rights Foundation and all the people on the ground that make this movement possible. Thank you, guys.